righteous acts. Another important aspect of tzedakah, or righteousness, is human well-being or right behavior. It is that which puts one in order before God. God's tzedakah is aimed at order in his creation and at leading his community to its goal and his salvific will and action, living righteously towards one another, God living righteously towards us. It all ties together, and it means the proper order of the world, as willed by Yahweh, which brings on prosperity. So this really ties back to this verse. So these three different versions, these three different iterations of tzedakah also denote the loyalty to God, to our community, and a saving gift. So in Ecclesiastes, let's see if I can, 5:13 and 14, it says, "There is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is the father of the son, but he has nothing in his hand." So this will tie in again to the wisdom literature found, and the wisdom literature has found about being diligent in our efforts in order to share them with others, endear ourselves to others by living righteously, so in times of trouble we can really help each other and be there for each other. Yes?
What you said, first of all, that's very, there are two or three things you've done today I think are terrific. The connecting us back to the Egyptian setting and then to the righteousness. Because in America, often we think, I hear people say that justice has to be tempered with mercy. But that word tzedakah, the word that's translated justice or righteousness, is a word that carries with it appropriate compassion. Mm-hmm. And so that if you're not fair to people who ask for forgiveness, you're not fair.
Right.
You're not just. You may think you're just because you're looking for the pound of flesh, but you're not being just. And so that being righteous involves investing in others. If you're not really doing that, you're not righteous. In Genesis 18, God has these angels come to Lot before there's a judgment of Sodom or Abraham, and they say, "Should I hide this thing that I'm going to do, since Abraham and his descendants are going to be responsible for helping humans understand what righteousness is?" And therefore he comes to him and says, "I'm going to destroy this city because of that." And then Abraham asks him, well, what does righteousness look like, is what he's asking, okay, in the context. But the context starts at 18, and we usually start at 19. Abraham says to him, "So will you destroy it if there's 45? And he gets down to 10. Mm-hmm. He's not bargaining with him like people often, incorrectly say. What he's doing is he's asking a question about what God said he was going to do. He's going to help him understand righteousness. And when it comes down to it, righteousness looks like compassion. He won't destroy a city if there's 10 righteous people, and in fact, he ends up saving the 3 righteous people who were in that city. That's what righteousness looks like. And so the idea of this righteousness you're talking about fits with this proverb in Ecclesiastes, and that's how righteous people act. Being just involves doing things that help other people.
It's interesting you mentioned that. That's a great segue to this little book I picked up. It's called Every Man's Talmud. It was written about 100 years ago by Abraham Cohen. And basically the Talmud is what started when in the Babylonian captivity, because they didn't have the temple to go through. They couldn't do everything they were commanded to by God because they were in captivity. So that's where synagogues started. That's where these rabbis started coming up. And the words of the rabbi, what we call the oral law these days, is the Talmud. Interestingly, in the section I just read, I keep this by my bed, and they break it down in little sections so it's digestible. They've now taken the rabbinic tradition of the oral law has taken everything in Leviticus 25 about the year of Jubilee and the restoration and the caring and just thrown out the window. It's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. So, yes?
So, your comments made me think of a couple scriptures in Luke. And briefly, in Luke chapter 6, he says, "Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. And then another scripture is Luke 16. I believe Jesus developed this concept, these verses right here in Luke 16 in a major parable. When there was a man who was wasting his employer's possessions and he was about to be let go, and he forgave all of these people, all these debts in the employer's name, and he said in verse 9, "And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings." That is actually set up in Luke chapter 14 and 34, when he says, "Salt is good, and if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no use to the soil or the manure pile. It's thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." He's pointing to the depravity of the religious people of their generation when they were failing to understand these concepts. And he really goes through 15 and 16 just making examples of how we can be different. And one of those is Luke 16, the man who forgave the debts of all these people to secure his own rights, his own eternal dwellings.
My brain's going in about 600 different directions right now. Those are great comments. No, it's perfect because I think I mentioned this on Wednesday night. Are we supposed to judge? Yeah, we are. We make judgments every single day. What coat am I going to wear? You know, what shoes am I going to put on? We make judgments all the time. We make judgments about people. Where we get into trouble is when we start doing the condemnation. And I think that's what he's talking about. We don't do that. We love and build up and strengthen one another. And if there is a judgment to be made about someone, we better look at that log in our eye and check our motives and make sure that our heart is like this, being generous and kind and loving and looking to take care and nurture rather than pointing out a fault. So great segue. Thank you so much. Man, the time is going crazy. Anyway, so let's move on if that's okay. We're going to go into question number 3. Are verses 3 and 4 a consecutive thought? Do they stand on their own or both? If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. If a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. What do you think? Are these connected, or are they standalone thoughts? Yes, Garrett.
I think they're absolutely connected. He's just saying, hey, stuff happens. Verse 3, clouds fall, clouds rain, trees fall. And if you're waiting for the thing to happen that you think is going to happen, and you're trying to predict the future, I'm going to hold my stuff, not do anything until, I can see in my crystal ball. You're not going to do anything.
Right.
And he goes into verse 5, you don't know the work of God who makes everything. So just get out there and do things.
Excellent. Yes.
James 1:22 comes to mind when I look at this. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves.
Yeah. Beautiful. That's a perfect verse to go with this. I put yes. Verse 3 talks about paying attention to things in nature and knowing what the results will be. I believe it could be a commentary on verses 1 and 2. I think this has already been said. Meaning that we need to pay attention to the people and circumstances around us so we're not taken by surprise, and so we can take action and be a blessing to others. If a cloud's full of rain, to your point, it's going to rain. If a tree falls wherever it falls, there it will stay. If people are in need, notice and help them. It's about paying attention. This verse also states where a tree falls, there it lies, and there it will stay. I've read some that the north and the south can mean up and down, meaning heaven and hell, and could indicate the state of the person when they die. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's something that I did read, and I wanted to lay that out there for you. Verse 4, my initial reaction would indicate daydreaming, head in the clouds, not paying attention to what's going on, which would dovetail nicely to the other thoughts we've shared, and will result in not doing the things that are necessary to care for yourself or others, and could lead to dire circumstances. In Galatians 6, 9, and 10, it says, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we'll reap if we do not give up." So I think this really comes together. And some scholars believe the opposite. By closely observing the wind, if it's coming from the hotter desert, the dry air will come in and no rain, and the moist ocean air is full of rain, then the farmer will know when to plant. And that might be part of it, but it seems, after everything we've just noticed, to be a kind of a shallow assessment of what's going on. It may be part of it, but we need to dig deeper like we have done. Yes?
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen over and over again in Ecclesiastes is that sometimes we imagine the things that we can do can completely transform everything there is in nature. And it's very, when you work with people, many of us are teachers or preachers or managers, and when you work with people, a lot of your success depends on what those people do. And you do the best you can to try to put them in a position to do the right things and fire them if they don't. But the truth of the matter is, you're still dependent upon them. And sometimes there's a cloud, and the cloud's just going to have to dump its water.
Yep.
And so that, if you could dodge the cloud, that's fine, but the cloud's going to drop its water. And sometimes the tree's going to fall. And so it's falling, one direction or the other. You might want to clear out where you think it's going to fall, because wherever it falls, that's where it's going to stay. And I've driven myself crazy rooting for people who just aren't interested in doing the things that are necessary for them to succeed in their own lives. And I think that most of us who are older have had that experience. And part of the thing to recognize is that when you've done the best you can do, you've done the best you can do. And that's just all there is to it. Finally, that's in their control, not yours.
Right. I had a doctor tell me just before we moved here, you can't save everybody. You're killing yourself.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we've got to make sure we take care of ourselves, too. We do what we can for others, but ultimately it's up to them, right? And that's for people who are compassionate and loving and caring, that's a hard thing. It's very hard for me. Great. So we need to move on because we're running out of time. And we've only got through, 4 verses. Okay, looking at verses 5 and 6. Is this a grouping of random points of wisdom, or is there an overriding theme? If you believe there is a theme, what might that be? Any themes here? Yes.
Well, I think verse 6 is kind of letting you know what the summary of the verse 5 verses are, and that is to be diligent and the value of the diligence, and so that not to be idle, but to continually work at what you do. And in verse 5, it reminds you that you don't know the work of God, and that God is out there working, and he has his earth set up in a way that for those that are diligent, there will be a prosper that will come from that in some fashion. It may be affected by other things, but there is a value to it. If the value is nothing more than bearing your cross and being there for your brother, that's a value of diligence. That's in Matthew chapter 16, where he's talking with the scribes and Pharisees and teaching his disciples when they're worried about things like they didn't remember to bring bread. Okay? In the first 4 verses, we're talking about the circumstances of what goes on, but he starts off by saying, put your fruit and your bread and your efforts out there, but don't put them all in one place, as it's been talked about. And so this is just a real summary of diligence here of how to stay active, how to stay fruitful, how to trust in God, and not worry about necessarily what you always can see.
Great point. You nailed both those verses. Anyone want to add something? Okay, so, yeah, I think also verse 5 stands in contrast to verses 3 and 4. Verses 3 and 4 uses things that are observable to make a point, and this verse describes things that we can't see and tells us that we can't see all of the workings of God. So, bear with me 1 second. There it is. Okay. In chapter 3:11, he has made everything beautiful in his time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yes, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And then in 8:17, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he cannot find it out, even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. And I think this is God's point, and this is part of the trust thing we've talked about. Verse 6 is an encouragement to be diligent, as has been mentioned, and consistent in the work that we do. Not knowing, once again, whether the morning or the evening work will prosper, there is another meaning. But there's another meaning in Hebrew, that the word seed would have the same meaning as the seed of David. There are things we don't see and can't understand. It still alludes to being prepared and watchful, and we need to take care of our business and others. And this continues the theme of being generous, taking care to do what we can daily to prepare ourselves and others for unforeseen circumstances. Okay, the next section, we got 10 minutes. The next section, do a brief outline of verses 7 through 10, and what can we learn through these? If you did do an outline of this, this is pretty, as compared to what we've just been through, we're getting into the lighter stuff and a little more surface level stuff, but it's still, I believe, a commentary on the groundwork that we've laid in the previous verses. So does anyone have an outline of verses 7 that they'd like to share? Don't make me do it again. Okay, I'll do it again. Here we go. Light is equivalent to life. Sweet is equal to honey, and when you combine those together, life is a pleasant thing and should be savored like honey. I didn't see anything deeper than that. If you saw something deeper than that, please raise your hand and let me know. But I think after going through and all this work that we need to be doing, we also need to be grateful and love the life that we have. Yes, Ed?
I like the bridge to the next verse that often is their translation, so that if you have that, that's your primary thought. Now, as you reflect on that, then the next verse fits right into that.
Please go ahead. That's verse. Verse 8.
I can't read, my eyes
Oh, okay, so verse 8. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. So, the first half continues the thought of savoring and enjoying life, even in old age. Make hay while the sun shines is what the thought that came into my head. The second half reminds us that dark days will come and will be many, and it speaks of our mortality and difficult times, because anyone who's lived as long as some of us here know that there's good times and there's hard times, and sometimes those hard times last a long time. But we need just to have faith. So this is where I remember the cup with the steaming vapors coming out of it. This is where I want to kind of address that, because vanity can also be translated in Hebrew as vapor.
Yes.
Our life is like a vapor, so enjoy it while we can. And that was the sense I got from that. Yes?
I think it's important to remember just what you said, that this word that we say, a lot of the modern translations almost often call it vanity. And that's an interpretation and not a translation.
Exactly.
The translation is vapor, and I wish they kept it at that, because the thing about a vapor is you actually don't know if it has value or not.
Right.
And so that Ecclesiastes may be saying that it has value, but you can't know what it is. But modern translations live in a culture where if we can't see the value of it, we don't think it's valuable, so we call it futility. That's interesting to me, that we've chosen to interpret vapor as futility when that's not all it means.
Right, and that's part of the westernization of the Bible that we need to be really, really careful about, because we can miss the mark if we don't understand these things. Great point. So moving on to verse 10. Verse 9, sorry. Rejoice, you young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. And my point was, enjoy your life while you're young and do the things that will cheer your heart and delight your eyes, but be cautious, knowing that God will judge you. And don't be foolish. And there's going to be a little more to add to this in just a second. Yes, Garrett?
I think this whole section is kind of like the flip side, but it's a continuation of the previous section where he's trying to get you up and out of either being afraid and holding on to things and trying to control things yourself. And I'm not putting my money out or my time out or putting anything at risk. And he says, get past that. Clouds are going to rain and trees are going to fall. You can get out of that. On the flip side of that, not only does that, yes, there are rainy days, but there's also sunny days. In verse 7, it's pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. You need to get out there and realize you can enjoy life, not only putting things out because God's in control of it all, but go out and enjoy it. If you get a long life, rejoice in it. Verse 8. If you're young, rejoice in your youth. Just you can go beyond fear.
Yeah.
You can go beyond not wanting to risk. There is joy in the fact that God is controlling it all.
Mrs. Castleberry.
I can't help but, as we went through this, it was reminding me of Romans 8, where Paul talks about, in verse 18, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And there's this sort of idea in this whole this whole chapter 11 of like this future, something's going to happen in the future. We don't know, if from Solomon or the author's point of view. He doesn't know, so he's trying to just do what he can with the time that he has. And Romans 8, I think, speaks to the backside of this, which is that God does know, and it says, creation was subjected to futility. That we're groaning, waiting for this future glory that's going to happen, and that getting back to your sort of righteousness of how it all works together. In verse 28, it says, we know that for those who love God, all things will work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. And so I think that whole section of Romans 8 sort of is the answer almost to this, which is that God knows and God has the plan in place. So we just need to do our part. And we don't even know what that is sometimes. We don't know, and it even talks about that in Romans 8. We don't know what to ask for. We don't know how to pray. And God has the Spirit there to intercede for us if we're coming with an honest heart, that God will hear those prayers, even when we don't really know how to say it.
That's beautiful, and thank you for quoting from my favorite book in the Bible. I'll tell you later. So that's, what you said. Beautiful. We're short on time, so I'm just going to take us home, if that's all right. Let's see. Enjoy your life while you're young, and I want to talk briefly about verse 10 before I conclude. Vexation, that is mentioned in verse 10, is anger, grief, sorrow, provocation. Pain is evil, misery, distress, injury, calamity, and wickedness. Time is wasted by focusing on these things in our youth. And when we're young, we got the hormones going, we got a lot of energy, and these things can come to the surface like this. And there's not many young people in here, but even in our age, we need to be aware and do the things necessary to protect ourselves from going to these places, because they are absolutely wastes of time. And to bring us home, the last thing I wrote in the question 6 was, we believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and from the first word in Genesis to the last word in Revelation, it is God's plan of salvation to bring us to Jesus. And I want to think about common patterns in the Bible, and does Ecclesiastes 11 represent a recurring biblical pattern or theme? I think we've already touched on that, using our resources, being generous to our brethren, but more importantly, holding on to our wealth is a form of idolatry. Let's see, where are we? Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Mammon is an extremely interesting word. It was never translated into Greek. It's the original Aramaic word. And what that word means in its Aramaic form is an abundance of material possessions and resources. To a first century reader, the term would have meant those things where you put your trust that are not God. So throughout the Bible, God has encouraged us to trust him and him alone. This is a major recurring theme, and if we're trusting in our riches, because let's face it, if we have a nice 401k and we're living comfortably, we feel good. When something's depleted and we live paycheck to paycheck, like we've probably all been there, it's very hard to trust that everything's going to be okay, but God says it's going to be okay, and you can trust in me. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for your time and participation.